Welcome to part 7 of my Blender for Complete Beginners tutorial series. So in this part we're going to be going over materials. So I'll show you how to add materials to objects, and we'll be adding some basic colors and materials to these different objects. Now before we start, I wanted to let you know about a product which I've created for adding materials to your projects, and that is my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack. So my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack comes with all of my procedural materials, and all of the materials are pre-set up in Blender's asset browser with custom thumbnails, sorted catalogs, and customizable node groups. So when you download and install the Ultimate Material Pack into Blender's asset browser, you can just drag and drop all of the materials into your 3D scenes. If you'd like to purchase the material pack, then I'll have the links in the description to where you can purchase the material pack. And if you'd like to just purchase packs of 10 materials, you can also check out my procedural material packs, and you can also purchase any of my materials individually on my Gumroad store. And if you'd like to learn how to create procedural materials, then I have a large Blender procedural material tutorial playlist where I show you how to create all of my procedural materials. Alright, so before you render an object, to preview the materials, there's two different ways you can do that, and that is by using these viewport modes. Now, we did go over these viewport modes briefly in a previous part. The main ones that we talked about were the wireframe for doing precise modeling, and then also the solid view. So to preview materials, when you're creating materials, you can use either the material preview, or you can also use the rendered mode. Now the material preview is going to add some temporary lighting to your scene, but when you render the image, it's not actually going to render with this lighting. Now the rendered mode, if you click here on this button, this is what it's actually going to look like when it renders. So you can see it looks all gray, and that's because we haven't added any lights or any materials, so everything is just very gray. And this background world here on default is very gray. So we're going to be using the material preview for now because we haven't set up any lighting yet. So we'll click here on the material preview, and I did mention this in an earlier part of the tutorial series, but if you hold down the Z button, this pie menu will come up and you can drag your mouse up to the material preview or the solid view or any of the modes. So the material preview is going to be down and the rendered view is going to be up. So I'll hold down the Z button, move my mouse down, and let go to go to the material preview. Now if you click here on the arrow, you can change some of the different settings. So if you want to use the actual scene world and scene lights, you could check mark these, but it's going to be all gray, so I'll turn that off. You can also click here, and this is going to give you some basically world lighting, and we'll be going over world lighting in the lighting part of this tutorial series. But you can see that there's these little icons here, and they're basically little spheres which are reflecting world lights. So you can change these, and then that'll change the light which is around your object, and it will light your scene. So I'm going to go with this one here. I think this one is pretty good for now. And then you can also change a few things like the strength, also the world opacity, so if you want to be able to see the world, and also the blur amount if you want to blur that. So you can do a few different things with the preview, but I'm just going to leave it like that. So now to manage the materials, we can click right over here on this little red circle button right here, and this is going to go to the material properties. So whatever object you have selected, it'll show the material right here on the material properties. So let's start by selecting the carrot, and then let's click on new here to add a new material. So now we have this basic material on the carrot, and you can see it is white because white is the default. Now if you click here, you can rename the material, so I can type in carrot. Now the base of a material is called a shader. So a shader is going to determine how the material actually looks. So whether it's very rough or very shiny, whether it has lots of bump, and whether it has different colors. And basically you can think of the shader as being what the material is made out of. So you could make like a glass shader or a metallic shader if it's metal, or just a normal shader for something like dirt or rock or another material. Now on default, the default shader is called the principled shader. And if you click right here, there are going to be many different shaders that you can choose from. So for example, if you wanted to change this to glass, if you wanted it to look like glass, you could change the shader. So you could click here on the principled shader, and you could, for example, go down here and change it to the glass BSDF, so the glass shader. And now you can see it kind of looks like glass. And then underneath the shader options, there are going to be different settings. So for example, there's a color here. That's a very basic one. So if you click here on this white color right here, it's going to bring up this color wheel. And I could change this so I could make it like a blue glass color. And then there's also a roughness. So right now it kind of looks like a frosted glass. If you click and drag the roughness value, that'll make it super rough. So it looks very frosted. You can't really see through it, or very shiny. I could also click here on glass and I could choose something else, like I could choose this glossy one. So this glossy one is kind of going to be like a metal, and you can see I can turn up that roughness So it looks kind of shiny. And there's many other ones here, like there's an emission. So if you choose emission, this one is going to be emitting light. So with this one, there is a color and a strength. So the strength value is going to make it brighter and it will emit light. So there are many different shaders. However, most of the time you're just going to use the principled shader, because you can kind of think of the principled shader as being like a base shader that you can create lots of different shaders. So what's really cool about the principled shader is that it has many different options, whereas these other shaders only have a few options. So the principled shader is kind of like one giant multi-purpose shader which you can use to create many different things. And you can see right here there is the base color that we just talked about, so you can make that color. There's also this metallic value, and so this is going to tell the material to be more like metal. So if I drag this value up, it's going to look more like metal because it's going to be more metallic. So now it looks kind of shiny and metal. And then there's also this roughness value, so you can drag this to make it really shiny if you want it to be a really shiny metal, or you can drag this up if you want it to be more rough. And then this IOR value is for things that are more like transparent, like glass or water. And then there's also this alpha value, and this alpha value is basically going to make it transparent. And then underneath these main values, there are also some other values. So for example, there is a subsurface here, and this is going to be used for creating like skin or making like food objects or objects which allow light to go through. You could also maybe use this for like a plant. If you have like a leaf and there's light shining through the leaf, there's going to be some subsurface scattering. And also skin has subsurface scattering. So if direct light is shining through skin, you can kind of see that red color, that red glowing color going through the skin. So subsurface scattering is basically light going through an object. And then there's also other ones here like specular and transmission. We're not going to go over all of these because this is a beginner tutorial, so I just want to introduce you to the most important things. There's also sheen here, and sheen is going to be used for creating cloth or fabric. And then there's also emission, so you can actually tell the principled shader to be emitting light. Now you can edit the materials on this side panel, but it's much easier to instead use Blender's shader editor. And so there's two ways to get to Blender's shader editor. One way is that you can click right over here on the shading workspace. So if you click over on shading, you can see it's going to bring you into the material preview, and I can press the 0 on the numpad to zoom into it. So it'll bring you into the material preview, and then it's going to have the shader editor right down here. And then it also is going to have a file browser, and this file browser here you can locate to like a textures folder on your computer, and then you can drag in image textures if you want to add texture maps to your objects, and we will be going over that later. And then over here, this is an image editor, so if you have textures, you can click on the drop down and you can choose textures just to preview the textures. But these things you probably aren't going to need most of the time. You're just going to need the 3D viewport and then the shader editor. So I'm going to drag this up so that I can see a little bit better, and I'm going to zoom in here. All right, so if I click back here, this will go to the materials. So this principled shader right here, which we just talked about, this is the same thing as this shader node. And so I prefer to use the shader nodes because you have much more control over them. Using it on the side panel is just a little bit limiting. It's a little bit hard to use just because it's on the side panel. You don't have as much control over it. But just remember that this over here and this over here, these are the same things, but using the shader editor, you have much more control and you'll be able to add different textures and things together. So for adding textures and adding different data, it really is just much better to use the shader editor. Now there is another way to go to the shader editor. If I click back here on the layout, we did talk about this earlier in the tutorial series, but what you can do is click in the corner and then click and hold and drag out to split any window, and then every window can be changed by its editor type. So if you click here on this drop down on the top left, you could change this to the shader editor. And now you can see it says the same thing, so it has the shader editor. So whether you want to just go to the shading tab right here, or whether you want to split the window, you can do which either one, because I prefer to have the 3D viewport right here and the shader editor right here. It's just a bit easier to see the material. Let's also press the N key to close that side panel, because right now we don't need that side panel. But the shader editor does also have a side panel by hitting the N key, just like the 3D viewport does. And also the T key can also be used to open a tools panel in the shader editor, and that's similar to the 3D viewport. Alright, so in the shader editor, you'll notice that there are different boxes here, and then you can click and drag the boxes to move them around. And then you can see there are also these wires here, which are going in between the boxes and connecting them. So these boxes in the shader editor, these are called nodes. And so this is where we can get into procedural nodes and the node system. So the shader is made out of a node, and then other textures and other images and other things which you add to the shader. If you want to add textures or if you want to add colors or other data, those are also going to be nodes. Now these wires here are used to connect up the nodes. So the wires are basically how all the nodes communicate. And these little circles here on all of these nodes, these circles are basically the sockets where the wires plug up. And if you click and drag on any of these circles here, it's going to bring out a wire. And so you can actually plug the different wires up to each other. Like I could click and drag and then plug this one up here. And then if I wanted to unplug it, I could click and drag and then just let go to unplug the wire. So again, the wires are how they communicate. Now, when I'm dragging this out here and then just letting go, it's going to go to the search. And so you can search for different nodes in the shader editor. So for example, what I could do is click on this base color and I could drag out and then I could let go and it will go to the search. And I could start to type in RGB and I could click on this RGB color. And now you can see that it's going to plug the RGB color up to the base color. So now this color here, because the RGB is going into the base color, it's basically overriding this original base color. So if I click and then drag and then let go, now you can see that the snowman's node is blue. And let's actually make it more like a carrot orange color. So I'm gonna kind of make it like a bright orange. However, if I wanted to override that or give it more data with different nodes, I could drag the color out. So I could pull out a wire here and then I can bring it really close and it will snap to that dot. And then I can let go and you can see it's going to connect. So now this instead is going to override it. And so I could make it any color now. Now the nodes communicate from left to right. So you can see first there is this RGB and this is color data. You can see it actually says color here. And this yellow dot is meaning that it's color data. And so it first starts over on this side and it has the color data. And then that color is going into the principled shader. And so the shader is actually going to have it like interact with the light and there's going to be like reflections and things. And then that principled shader is finally going to go into the material output. And in order for the nodes to actually be previewed on the object, they eventually need to be going into the material output. So if I click and drag here and then let go, you can see that now the material is fully black and there's no shading, there's no like lighting information, it's not reflecting the light or anything, and that's because it doesn't have any shader data. If I were to just take like this RGB and put the color into the surface, you can see it's just going to be one blank color, but again, because it doesn't have shading information, it's just going to be one flat color. So it kind of looks like a cartoony shader because it doesn't have any lighting or reflections. So I can put the principled BSDF, click and drag on this dot here, and drop it into the surface. And you might have noticed that these different dots here are also different colors. And so there's basically 4 main colors. So the yellow one here, that is going to be telling it that it is color data. So this RGB curves has colors, and so the yellow one is color data. Now these gray ones here, these are going to be either black and white data or color data. So it might be information anywhere between white and black, or it might be information of different numbers like 1 through 10, for example. Now these green ones here, these are shader data. And so this principled shader, it is a shader. And so you can see that the green one is at the end of the shader. And then at the starting of the material output is also shader data. And so because you need to plug shader data up to the material output, it is green. And then also any purple one is either going to be vector data or normal data, and we'll be going over that later. But normal data is basically going to be like a surface bump. So you might have some like rock or dirt texture, and you might plug what's called a normal map up to the normal, and that's going to make it look like the surface is bumpy. Now, generally speaking, you want to plug the same colors up to each other. So the color you want to plug up to color, normal, which is purple, you want to plug that up to purple, and then gray to gray, and then also green needs to go into green. However, there is an exception to this, and that is that color data and black and white data or number values, those can actually be plugged into each other. So you can mix yellow values and gray values, but the purple data should only go into the other purple datas, and then the green data should only go into the green data. And I will be going over many more things about the shader editor later in the tutorial series. If you'd like to watch my introduction to procedural shader nodes, then you can check out that tutorial with the link in the description, or you can just wait until later in the tutorial series when we start to create some basic procedural materials. Alright, so I'm just going to click here and drag this over to make it smaller because for now we don't really need this. So I'll just zoom out here. So what I'm going to do now is add a few basic materials to the snowman. So I will actually use this real quick because this is the carrot material, but we kind of messed around with it. So I'm going to click on this RGB here, and then to delete this node, I can hit the X key. So X to delete that node. So now you can see that it is orange, so I'm just going to make that an orange color. And then also this roughness value right here, I might want to make this a little bit more shiny so I can drag the roughness down. And then also a carrot isn't going to be metal, so this metallic value, I can drag that all the way down to 0. And then what we can do is actually just close the shader editor because we don't really need it right now. So what I can do is click here when that little crosshair appears in the corner. I can hold down my mouse and then drag over, and you can see it turns into an arrow, and then I can let go to close that. Alright, so for now, just creating some basic materials, we're going to use the shader editor right over here. So let's now select the hat object, and then right over here we can click on new to add a new material to the hat. And I can click here to rename this, and I'm going to rename this to hat black. So now we can change a few of the settings. So here on the base color, I'll click on this, and I'm going to make it like a very, very dark gray. So not fully black, but like pretty dark. And then also this roughness here, I could drag this down. So it's going to be more reflective. So if I turn it way too far down, it looks very shiny, kind of like a plasticky material. So I'll just turn it down a little bit, something like that. And then let's select the scarf object. We can click here on new to add a new material to the scarf. And I like to rename these. So let's click on this and I'll rename it to scarf. And then later in the tutorial series, I will be showing you how to add textures, and we're going to be adding a fabric texture to the scarf. But for now, I'll just click on the base color and I'll make this kind of like a red color. And then here I can use this slider value to also make it darker. And then I also want to add a material to the coal eyes. So let's select the coal. I can click on new here. I can click here to rename it, and I can rename it to coal. And then for this base color, I'll click on this and I'll make it fully black. And I want the coal to be pretty rough. So this roughness here, I can turn this up, and now you can see that little highlight or reflection is going to go away because it's more rough. Now, what if you want to add the same material to different objects? Well, what you can do is select the object, and then instead of adding a completely new material, you can instead click on this drop down. And this drop down is going to show you the other materials which you already have created in that Blender project. So what if I have many objects that I want to add the same material to? Well, what I can do is hold down the shift key, and I'm going to shift select all of these objects. And then lastly, I will hold down the shift key and select this object last. So I'm selecting this object last, so it has a yellow outline, so it is now considered the active object, and this one also has the coal material. So I can now use that link and transfer data feature, which we did talk about earlier in the series, but if you press Ctrl L, that will bring up those settings. And what I want to do is click on link materials. So when you click on this, all of the objects that are selected are going to have the same material as the active object. There we go, they now all have the same material. Let's also add the snow material, so I'll click on the snowball, I can click on new, and I can just rename this to snow. And then if I go here to the base color, I can make this like fully white. And again, later on in the series, we'll be creating a procedural snow material using the shader nodes. But for now, we're just going to click on this object, click on the drop down and choose snow. And let's click on the arms here. Let's click on new, and I can just like rename this to bark or sticks. And then here on the base color, let's click on this. And for now, I'm just going to make this kind of like an orangey color and then make it darker, and that way it'll be kind of brown. So if you want to make brown, you need to first make orange, and then you can make it darker, and that kind of makes a brown color. And then this is kind of very shiny. You can see it almost looks like plastic because it's so shiny. So let's turn this roughness up to make it more rough for now. All right, that is good. Let's select this object here. Let's also press Ctrl S to save the project. And then I can click on this drop down and we'll choose the bark again. And then let's go down here to the buttons, and I'm going to click on the button. Let's click on new to add a new material. And this one I can just rename to button. And then for this one, I want to take the base color and I want to make it like a bright blue color. And then because this is like a shiny plastic, I do want to turn this roughness value down a bit so it's a bit more shiny. Now there's another way to add the same material to another object. And that is that you can click here on this little button, the button with the circle there of the material, and you can click and drag. So if you click and drag, you can see it'll actually give you that material data and it will follow your mouse. And then you can drag it over another object and let go, and it will add that material to that object. Let's also make a thread material, so I'll click on the thread here. I can click on new, and I can rename this. So click here and I'll rename it to thread. And then here for the base color, I'm just going to make this like fully black. So make that black. And then we could also turn this roughness up a little bit so it's not quite that shiny. And then again, you could click and drag right here and drop it onto the object, or you could just select the thread. You could click on the drop down and then you can just find it here. And this is why it's really useful to name all your materials and keep everything organized, because if we didn't rename all these, it would just be like material.001, material.002, and it would be a little bit hard to see what material is actually there. So I'm going to choose the thread there. Alright, so far we just have one material on each object. However, what if we want to add a different material to another part of the object? So for example, here on this top hat, I have this little kind of like ribbon thing, which is around the bottom of the hat, and I want to make this be a red material. Well, you can actually add multiple materials within the same object. And to do that, we're going to use this box right here. So currently we just have one material on all these different objects, but you can actually add multiple materials within the object. And so these are called material slots, and so you can add different materials into material slots. So to add a new material slot, we're going to click on the plus here, and this plus here is going to add a new material slot. So now you can see it's a blank material, but if I click on new here or choose the drop down, I can either choose a pre-existing material or I can click on the new button. So let's make a new material, and then I can just rename this to hat red. So now we have hat black and hat red. Now right now the entire material is only using the hat black, and this hat red, let's click on the base color and I can make it like a bright red color. So now I want to make just this part here, kind of that lip there with the ribbon, I want that to be the hat red. Well, to do this, we need to go into edit mode and we need to tell those faces to be that material. So we'll hit the tab key to go into edit mode, and when you go into edit mode, you can see these three buttons appear. So there's assign, select, and deselect. So for example, I could click on the black hat here, and then I could click on select, and it will select all of the faces which have that black hat. I could also click on the hat red and then press A to deselect everything and click on select, and you can see it's not going to select anything. So what you can do is you can first select the material that you want to add, then you can select the part of the mesh that you want to be that new material, and then you can choose the assign button, and it will assign that material to just those faces. So what I'm going to do is click on the face select, and then I will hold down the Alt key and I'll click right here to select that loop of faces. Then I can zoom in and I'll hold down the Shift and Alt key and select that loop of faces right there. So now we just have that ribbon part selected. So then you can select the hat red in the material slots and you can click on the assign button. And then I can hit tab to go back to object mode. So now you can see that just the ribbon part is going to have the red part of the hat. And I can also turn the roughness down if I want to. Let's press Ctrl S again to save the project. Alright, so before we finish this part, I do want to go a little bit more depth into procedural materials, and we are going to make this coal material look a little bit more bumpy. So let's select this material here, and then you can either split the window and add the shading workspace, or you can click over here on the shader editor. And so what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be adding what's called a procedural texture, and we'll be putting the procedural texture here into this normal data, and the normal data is going to make it look like it has some surface bump so that this coal material looks kind of rough. So if something is procedural in Blender, then it's not using any external files. So for example, if you had a texture map like a PNG or JPEG image, that would be an external file that you downloaded and have on your computer. However, procedural textures are textures which are just in Blender, so they're basically built into Blender. So what I can do is press Shift A for the add menu. So just like in the 3D viewport, we have an add menu, or you can also click here on add and you can add all of the different nodes. And there are many nodes here, but I'm just going to show you the main basic ones that you'll need to know. So I'll press Shift A for the add menu, and then you can go here to texture, and you can see there are many different procedural textures. So you could make like a brick wall with a brick texture, there's also a checker texture, there's also a gradient texture which goes from white to black, and there's also some other ones like this magic and the Musgrave and noise. I'm going to be using this noise texture, this is a very common one. So you can either just go here to the search, and then you can start to type in noise and add the noise texture, or you can go to the add menu and click here on texture, and then you can click on noise. I usually know exactly what texture I'm going to be adding, so I usually just press Shift A for the search and then go to the search. And you actually don't need to even click on the search, you can just immediately start to type for the node. So here's the noise texture. And you can see that this noise texture is orange. So basically all the different types of nodes are color coded. So the shader nodes are green, and then the texture nodes are orange, and there are some other colors. Now, just to preview what the noise texture is doing, I can take this factor. So the factor is going to be black and white data, and I can take the factor and I can drag this over here and stick it into the surface. And that way I'll be able to preview what it's looking like. So this is what the procedural noise texture is. So it's basically these random little lumps here of light and dark color. And so we'll be able to use this to make the coal look bumpy. So just like on the principled shader, how there are different values which you can change, you can also change different values on all the other nodes. And you can especially change these different values on the textures. So let's say that I wanted to make this texture look very detailed. Well, I could just turn this detail up, so I could drag it over, and you can see if I drag it over to 15, it's going to stop, and that's because it's the maximum value. So if I turn it to 0, you can see it just looks very blobby, but if I drag it up to 15, you can see it looks much more detailed. Now there's also a scale value, so if I wanted to make the noise texture very small, I could drag that scale, and now you can see it's very small, or I could like drag this way down, and now it's much bigger. And there's also some other ones here, like you could distort the texture. You could also add this cool roughness, so if I turn this roughness up, it's going to kind of be another level of detail, so I could make it very detailed or less detailed. So for now, I'm just going to turn this scale up, and I can actually type in like 10, and then also this detail, I can leave it to 15. So I can now take this noise texture, and I want to put this noise texture data into this normal value. And this normal value is going to make it look like the surface is bumpy, because the normal is going to be the surface bump. So I can take this factor here, which is the black and white data, and I can stick this here into the normal. And then what I want to do is take this principled shader, and I can take this and put it back into the surface so I can preview it again. Now, I did mention this earlier, but generally you don't want to put the different colored sockets into each other. You want to put the same colored sockets into each other. And you can see that this is a good demonstration of why you would want to do that. And so what's happening is because this black and white data doesn't convert well into this normal data, you can see something is wrong with the shader. If I move around here, everything looks really black, and there's kind of like some weird shading, and there's just some issues. And so this is because this factor data, this black and white data, isn't supposed to directly go into the normal. So there are converter nodes which will convert different types of data into other types of data. And so we are going to be adding what's called a bump node, which will take this black and white data and it's going to convert it into normal data. And so then the normal data is going to make that surface bump on the material. So we can press Shift A and we can click here for the search, and we can start to type in bump. So let's choose the vector bump. And then what we can do is we can just actually drag this bump node over a wire. And when you drag it over a wire, you can see it's going to be highlighted. And then if you click to place it, it's going to add it into this wire setup. Now there still is the same problem, and that is because this is still going into the purple dot. So to convert this black and white data, which was that noise, into the normal bump data, we can instead unplug it from the normal and we can put it into the height value instead. So now you can see it's going in as this black and white height value, but then it comes out here on this side as normal data. And there we go. So now if I zoom in here, you can see it kind of looks like a chunky rock or coal material. And then let's actually turn the scale down. So I might turn the scale down to like a 6, so it is a bit smaller. So now you can see it looks like a chunky coal or rock material, and it looks very rough. Now this bump node also has settings to control the material. So for example, there's a strength value. So if you want it to be very, very subtle, you could turn that strength value way down. Or if you want it to be very bumpy, you could drag the strength value up. So I'm going to click on the strength value, and I'm just going to type in like a 0.2. So it is kind of subtle, but there's still just a little bit of surface bump. There's also an invert here, so the invert is going to invert the values. So the values which appear as though they're popping out are going to go back in, and the values which are going in are going to come out. Now, you might be wondering if this is actually editing the actual geometry, because it appears as though the geometry has much more detail, and it appears as though it's very bumpy. But this normal data, this actually isn't affecting the geometry, because this is just the shader editor, and so it's just affecting the shader. If I hit the tab key to go into edit mode and zoom in here, you can see it's not actually affecting the geometry. This is still a pretty low poly mesh. You can see here are the vertices and edges and faces. So again, it's not actually affecting the geometry. If we go to the modifiers, this displacement texture, which we added earlier in the series, that is actually going to affect the mesh, but this shader here, that is not going to affect the actual shape of the mesh. So you can sort of think about this as like a fake bump. So it's not actually making the object bumpy, but it's making it appear as though it's bumpy using the shader editor. So let's go back over here to the layout, and I will press Ctrl S again to save, and this will wrap it up for this part of the tutorial series. So if you're interested in learning more about procedural materials, then later in this tutorial series we are going to be making a few more procedural materials, so you will get some more practice using the procedural nodes. However, I have many procedural material tutorials on my YouTube channel, and I actually have a Blender procedural material tutorial playlist where I show you how to make many different procedural materials. I also have an introduction to procedural shader nodes video, and that video goes more in depth into the basics of procedural shader nodes, so you could also check out that video with the link in the description. And if you'd like to purchase my procedural materials product, then definitely check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack, which comes with all of the procedural materials that I've created, and they're all pre-set up for Blender's asset browser, and they all have custom thumbnails, they're sorted into catalogs, and they all have customizable node groups to control the look of the material. So once you set up the material pack in Blender's asset browser, you can just drag and drop the materials into your projects to add materials to your 3D scenes. You can also purchase all of my materials individually on my Gumroad store, and you can also purchase my procedural material packs, which are just packs of 10 materials. And of course, you can definitely check out my procedural material tutorial playlist to learn how to create your own procedural materials. So in the next part, we're going to be covering UV unwrapping, and UV unwrapping is what you're going to need to do before you add external image textures onto your objects. So when the next part is released, it's going to be right up there on the end screen, and also the link will be in the description. So I hope you're enjoying this, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next part.